Welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. Thanks for joining us today. Your hosts are myself, David Himovich, and Alicia Cade, both within Google Cloud's Office of the CISO. You can find and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So Alicia, today we have an accomplished global executive joining us. Our guest is Betty DeVita, a seasoned public and private board director, known for her extensive experience in digital transformation, consumer financial services, and payments. And this is really cool. She's been inducted into the Women's Executive Network Hall of Fame as one of Canada's most powerful women.
That's right, David. Betty's career is remarkable. She's currently a board member for FinConnecta, a global technology company. And furthermore, she held executive roles in financial services at MasterCard as the Chief Commercial Officer of Digital Payments and Labs and as the President of MasterCard Canada. And prior to that, she was the chair and CEO of Citibank Canada Inc. Her background from payments innovation to navigating major financial institutions gives her a unique lens on corporate risk management. And I'm looking forward to hearing all about it.
Great. Let's get to the discussion. So welcome, Betty. Before we dive into the discussion, Alicia and I mentioned in the intro that you are an accomplished global executive with extensive experience in both digital transformation and consumer financial services. You also have experience working on, obviously, public and private boards. And I know you're very active in the broader board community as well, including organizations like NACD, where we've had the opportunity to meet and catch up on some of these critical topics. So a very warm welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Very much appreciate it.
So based on your experience working with boards that have kind of varying levels of cyber risk exposure, what are some of the most striking fundamental differences between a board that has enhanced cyber oversight and one that's still developing, let's say, its cyber risk fluency? And do you think there's like a key profile or change that a less fluent board could potentially take to quickly gain the expertise that it needs in cyber?
Sure. So I love to look at things from the perspective of kind of an offensive play and a defensive play, both offense and defense. If I think of advanced boards, they treat cyber with both of these lenses. On defense, they drill into resilience, how fast they can detect, contain, and recover. On offense, they see cyber as a necessary enabler. And, they need this to be able to build the trust with their customers and the guardrails that let them innovate because they're in the midst of cloud transformation, working with AI, et cetera. On the contrast, I'm going to say developing boards still silo cyber, and they treat it as if it's a compliance checklist instead of a strategic driver. And perhaps the instinct in either case, if the composition of the board is not filled with techie or a cyber expert, is to bring one on board. But, is that really enough? Perhaps a better move is adding a director with kind of dual or multiple fluencies, someone who understands both cyber and digital transformation. But here's kind of the key point. It can't just rest on one person. The entire board has to have a baseline fluency. So every director can connect cyber to the risk framework, to the risk appetite, and also to the resilience that they're trying to build. So it isn't only about defense. And when I say offense, it's not about offense from the standpoint of the strategic imperatives of the board. But, the way that they look at capital allocation would be kind of the way that I would love them to be able to talk about cyber in terms of risk, return, and resilience. And I'll end there. So, or maybe I won't end there. There's a lot of discussion about specialists from a board profile perspective. I think they're quite helpful, and I love having some of my colleagues that are specialists, but I do think it doesn't minimize the requirements of some level of fluency by all board directors.
That's really interesting. I'd like to later on to talk a little bit more about the defense and the offense, because this is like really original and interesting take. But before we get there, you have just spoken to us about mature boards and boards who perhaps need to grow their expertise. I'd like to really touch on with your views of what are the absolute cornerstones, the essentials without which the boards can't do in terms of the effective risk management in the cybersecurity sphere.
Again, with this notion of, basic minimums from a defense perspective, ensuring that the risk appetite and the oversight mandate is clear, that cyber is embedded in their risk framework, like capital or liquidity. If the board hasn't defined its tolerance, how does management calibrate their defenses, right? It's a requirement for management to be able to understand the framework in which they operate. That there is decision quality reporting, and so that it's not a once a year slide deck, but ongoing metrics with regard to the resilience, the detection, the containment, the recovery, because there will be activity that happens, hopefully not that often from a defense perspective, but it's not a once a year exercise. We'll leave it at that. And that there has been some rehearsed response plans, that the directors have gone through some tabletop exercises, that they know the role that they play in these tabletop exercises, not if, but frankly, when a breach occurs. It's a muscle that needs to be built. And so these tabletop exercises and these cyber kind of war games, if you will, are an important part of building that muscle. And then the one for me, which is so critically important, is access to the CISO. And directors really needing to understand the language that the CISO is talking, which means that the CISO needs to be able to speak in business terms, and that they can, have a conversation around how the cyber framework fits into the business strategy and the risk framework and appetites of the overall company. Again, on the proactive side, on the offense side, for me, that's really around fluency and being able to understand how to connect cyber risk to the growth and the digital ambitions that the company has. Every board director does not need to be a cyber expert. That's not what I'm saying. But you do need to know the questions that you need to be able to ask, and how that risk and how these guardrails shape the strategy and the future in a world, obviously, that's more and more technology driven. And so having the lone, again, back to cyber expert, isn't going to move the needle for the company if everyone else at the table is not understanding kind of what the risk implications are, both from an offense and a defense perspective. And, this takes building relationships, and it takes some practice, which is, this notion of building some muscles with regard to this scope of work.
I really like that. There were kind of two things you mentioned there. One was around having kind of a common language that boards and their management teams are using. And I think that the other one was kind of having, good relationships, because it's really not boards and their management kind of having conversations now that result in just a yes or a no answer, right? There's a big kind of gray area between there. So I think kind of the question that I'm really getting at is, what are some of those best practices or that ideal language that a board could have with their CISO to create sort of a mutual understanding and a clear accountability between the board and the executive team, particularly as we're thinking about things like cyber investment, for example?
So I'll start with, the CISO doesn't need a board seat, but they do need a direct voice to the board for the ability to speak in business terms. And maybe the conversations happen in a bit more detail at the committee level, but there's nothing to say that committee members of either the risk committee or the technology committee or the audit committee, wherever cyber is handled, and it's handled depending on the company and different committees, can actually have one-to-one relationships even before the committee meetings. In fact, that's kind of the best practice. But as most companies have started to select a global framework for how they manage cyber, whether it's the NIST framework or in financial services, FFIEC and CAD. And, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, but I do know that these frameworks start to give you guidelines, and some more prescriptive than, kind of framework driven, to how a company is measured in terms of their oversight and governance to the cyber type of challenges that are out there. And budget requests come in all the time for specific asks to try and get to the next level of the framework. And so, you want to go to mature or advanced, et cetera. And it's a challenge for board directors to analyze those budget requests. Having said that, on almost every other request, you're looking at risk acceptance, you're looking at return on investment. And I think cyber is a bit, I don't want to say art and science, but it's a bit of a challenge, because if a company is dealing with a cyber issue, the return on investment is really more based on ensuring that they get back to perhaps more of a neutral position than a vulnerability that they've been exposed to, versus perhaps an innovative CISO who is looking for kind of the next generation tool, that there might not be a good framework or return on investment in order to be able to put a business rationale against going to that next level. But this CISO has some insight based on the type of industry they're in, that investment actually makes sense for them to move the organization to the next level, knowing that they're deploying a new infrastructure, et cetera. There are so many nuances to what the potential asks are. And, also many of these come with asking for incremental FTE. So I think the board has to use all of their resources to be able to resist the kind of binary yes, no, and really have conversations with the management around, are there opportunities to automate? Are there opportunities to outsource? Can we pilot this in a way that ring fences the organization and doesn't give us a 3 or 5 year commitment, and have some proof of concept that gives the organization a bit more comfort with regard to just going for a new technology without necessarily having the comfort on whether or not that's going to provide a return. So there's a balance here. And how do you manage the rigor of the framework, stay at the latest level of the evolution that you're looking for, but also give the management the space to innovate responsibly and reduce risk? And I would love to be able to have the magic bullet to give you the answer. I think this is an ongoing conversation, and it really depends on the particular board initiative and where you sit within the framework at the particular moment. But it is going to be something that you're going to have to deal with on a regular basis, and perhaps going back at the end and asking the CISO to give you their view on how to manage this and how they actually do their assessments from their team could be an interesting angle to try and get some information for the board as well.
I know you mentioned not having the silver bullet, but I think you have a ton of great nuggets of information in there that are going to help a lot of board members out.
And indeed, great perspectives. And actually, I want to touch on the perspective and the angle you were applying to your thinking that we've heard already in this conversation. And it seems to be a theme. The offensive, defensive. So, of course, we know that defensive strategies, especially in cybersecurity, involve focusing on protecting the systems by implementing barriers, monitoring, and response. In offensive term, of course, in military terms, is attack the attacker, right, the adversary. And again, in cyber terms, it involves attacking your own system, pretending you're attacking your own system. So red teaming, penetration testing, all that good side. So I really want to go back to this point of view you indicated earlier and get your thoughts on perhaps what does it really mean from the board perspective and how the board should be thinking about those different angles at the strategy level, the defensive strategy versus offensive strategy.
Sure. I mean, I'll just, defense is kind of this bedrock, this third party risk management, understanding the catching, the controls. Again, I'm not the cyber expert, but, for me, offense is around the proactive risk management. I mean, obviously, if you're putting a new piece of software out or a new platform, you're going to do pen testing, and continuous stress testing of the system. But for me, it's about strategic training, not just an annual awareness module, but realistic tailored exercises at the board level. Those simulations are where directors can practice the when, not if scenario, and ultimately a culture of security that gives this ownership across the enterprise. The employees should not see cyber as just compliance, but as a part of how they do their job. And that cultural investment amplifies all the defensive work, right? So, defense might be about protection. Offense perhaps is about readiness. And a board that funds and that is interested in understanding their employee fluency, just as I talked about the board director fluency, helps create this muscle memory and also the culture to be able to respond when, not if, a breach comes. So for me, it's about really enabling the broader enterprise to be not just aware of phishing campaigns once a quarter or once biannually when we're all getting the check the box, but it's to really understand that, every attachment they get is an opportunity to have somebody get in the door. And it's interesting at the board level, you do see the metrics about employees and the number of times that they have clicked on attachments, which, after 3 or 4 is kind of interesting. But again, offense for me is more about the proactive risk management and having that built as a culture.
Yeah. And actually, I wanted to take that theme about being proactive and really thinking about the risk culture and maybe think about the broader ecosystem and risk footprint that every company has to deal with, which is supply chain risk and third-party risk management, which seems to be almost like an existential conundrum in cybersecurity space because there isn't one easy way, one easy silver bullet to be able to assess one's third-party risk. And again, when I say third-party risk, it's perhaps broader ecosystem of your suppliers. So, and companies rely on vendors everywhere. And the velocity of the business demands changes, that whole ecosystem changes as well. And companies need to onboard the new vendors. Of course, you want to have a rigid set of rules and due diligence process. But again, you don't want to make sure this kind of creates a bottleneck of compliance, and you want to be resilient. So what are your views? How the companies and the boards can make sure they maintain competitive advantage in this dynamic, broad ecosystem being secure?
Yeah, I mean, imagine the volume of third-party vendors that hit across a large financial institution, that hit across a large cloud provider. I mean, so for me, it starts with understanding what that third-party ecosystem is, who the critical vendors are, what cyber assurances they provide, and how that ties back to our risk appetite, which is like, I kind of keep going back to the risk appetite because clearly the board needs to understand that. It's not just a contract checklist, right? It's ongoing visibility into the resilience of this relationship and the assurances and the patches and et cetera, right? It's an ongoing process. But if you take cloud providers as an example, like Google, they're often the backbone of many digital businesses, and boards should be asking, so what type of assurances do you help provide as such a strategic vendor? And how can you help, boards and management teams feel more confident, right? I think this podcast is a terrific example of kind of great training, thought leadership, and content that curious and interested board directors are listening to say, what kind of tidbits can I get to be able to understand how to manage this role a bit better? And to be asking management like some oversight questions to make the board director feel a bit more comfortable, right? And you also mentioned speed matters, right? We can't have this arduous due diligence process that turns into bottlenecks, right? And the trick is ultimately building a framework that scales. And that's kind of a trick in a lot of business, endeavors. And is there a way to tier the vendors by criticality and help automate some basic checks and focus the board's oversight on the most material third-party exposures? So for me, it's kind of a balance between rigor, but without the drag, so that if we have the guardrails in place, management is empowered to be able to move fast. But I think the critical suppliers in general, like yourselves, really need to understand what this landscape is. And it is something that there should be a conversation about the supply chain, right? It's not a small, risk. And as part of these updates with the CISO and the risk team, it should be a fairly extensive conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I cast back my mind to my CISO days, and absolutely everything about collaboration with suppliers there were about shared responsibilities model. And I think what is important, and again, from Google Cloud perspective, we apply that, is actually thinking about it because we one ecosystem as a shared fate model, meaning we all have the common goal in our risk management, because actually it's good for us when our customers are secure, and it's good for our customers when we are secure, of course. So, hey, we all in the same boat. So it's about...
Yeah, everyone's brand is involved, right? Exactly.
It's beyond transaction. It's really about making sure that this ecosystem is secure. And of course, it sounds beautiful. It's quite challenging in practice. But what it gives you is this understanding that, why the assessment is important, and us understanding your risk footprint, our risk footprint being understood by customers. It's not us and them, it's us together. And then what you've mentioned as well, the speed and ability to respond, not only from commercial perspective, but actually when incidents do happen or there is a big threat happening, how can we make sure that we mutually kind of immunize ourselves against it, or actually we are able to respond to it together fast and in the most effective way? And the kind of other side is, of course, exercising. We were talking a bit earlier about exercising, is bringing into exercises those critical service providers and really checking, okay, are we going to be resilient? I mean, if you go down, what do I do? But also, how can we maintain this operability that we need to maintain to provide services to our customers? So the joint exercising, joint thinking about the resiliency is really important. And I think that mindset really changes the game.
Couldn't agree more. As I think about, I'm in the financial services vertical. There are critical third-party vendors that are basically our partners. They're not like vendor doesn't feel like the right word, right? It is basically our partner. So the notion of having this assessment together, and when you go down, they're there for you, and actually testing that is, that's hygiene factor, right? Like you have to have that as part of your operating, playbook, if you will.
Yeah. And maybe just one more thing that came to my mind. Again, when the boards look with their CISOs at the threat landscape, even though perhaps that update might include information about threat trends or examples that actually are nothing to do with the company or with your suppliers, but might have happened somewhere else, because this is what trends now. This is what attackers tend to do. It's important to start thinking, could it happen within our supply chain? Not only could it happen to us, but could it happen within our supply chain? And actually, can we check whether and have we checked whether our suppliers are immune to it or actually have exercised against it and know they can be resilient to it? So there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what's going on out there, rather than just waiting and preparing perhaps for the unexpected.
Yeah, I mean, threat actors are not necessarily looking for just proprietary, like it's not the notion of expanding the aperture on threat actors and understanding what's happening across industries within your competitors, et cetera. It's not just a proprietary discussion. So that's, I think very much like the fraud universe, right? The threat actors are trying to get into any kind of channel they can get into.
Yeah. So Betty, I have to ask you the inevitable question while we have you still about AI, because boards and really everybody today are grappling with the kind of the risks and the opportunities with its use. So as a director, how does the board's oversight of AI risk compare perhaps to the way that boards have handled other major digital transformations? And so I'm thinking about, the rise of the internet and cloud computing. And are there lessons learned from, those transformations that can now be applied to AI?
I'm happy to say that I was not sitting on a board during the rise of the internet. But I would frame this again in terms of this defense and offense. And so on the defense side, AI oversight has to address the kind of the equivalence of what we've seen on the cloud adoption, what I would say vendor concentration, resilience, shared responsibilities with this, like the data provenance and looking at where and what this data is, security, bias, ethics. Boards need to have the guardrails and the accountability framework so that the risks don't undermine the trust that you're trying to build as you move into what the different AI use cases would be for you. On offense, though, the pace and scale are very, very different, right? You guys could tell me the time frame it's taken for cloud adoption, but we have made leaps and bounds, let's say. But AI is moving in, an incredibly rapid cycle, and it's pervasive, right? Every employee is using it in some way, whether in drafting, search, workflow tools, and personally for their own lives. And the board's role isn't to, in my opinion, debate adoption. It's to make sure that the company's culture can capture the enterprise value responsibly and strategically with the right use cases. I don't think we can underestimate governance. We have to set expectations early, not after the risks materialize, kind of anchor oversight and business outcomes, ensuring that we have articulated risk appetite and that we've selected appropriate use cases to start with. And the takeaway for me is defense is managing the risks of AI, offense is unlocking the enterprise value. And we have to be able to lead with both. But with the pervasive use of how employees are using AI, again, it's how do we leverage this in a responsible way with the right guardrails, with the right oversight, focused on how to unlock this enterprise value, knowing that, your oversight has given management an ability to move quickly, not have the drag, but also ensure that there is trust with the data, that you are out there. And, one of the challenges is, and I know there was a soundbite about the number of times in earnings reports that AI was mentioned, right? It's not about it being cool. It's about it really ultimately having impact strategically on the enterprise. And I think that's one of the challenges that both management and boards are kind of, if they've gotten the governance and the oversight side of it right, how do they now leverage how to really scale the key components of AI use cases that will transform their organization? And again, both sides of the equation for board directors. And I think there's just such a helpful frame to be able to analyze the issues that we're facing across so many different vectors, frankly.
Yeah. Well, I think this has been a fantastic discussion. I really liked this theme kind of throughout of kind of this play on offense versus defense. And in fact, we may have found the title of our episode here, I think. So before I let you go, though, I do have to ask you the one drop the mic question that we've asked everyone that's been on this show, which is, what is one key action that boards should take away from today's discussion?
I would say building fluency and not dependency on one board director. Every director should have enough grounding to connect these risks and opportunities to strategy, growth, and resilience. Defense protects the business, offense grows it. And when the board builds fluency together, it doesn't just secure the enterprise, it strengthens the culture actually of the company and of the board. And as directors come together to try and tackle this massive shift, that's how you secure the future. And it is a huge shift with cyber and AI and just all of the challenges that companies are facing and boards are facing at a much faster velocity, I think, than they were, before.
Great answer. Absolutely. So, Betty, thank you very much for joining us today in the Cyber Savvy.
My pleasure. My absolute pleasure.
Thank
Great
you so much. Thank you for a great debate.